Our first guest tonight, he's a good friend of the program. He's a man doing tremendously important work for the better part of 4 decades now. His name is Dr. Dennis McKenna. He should be no stranger to listeners of this program. We welcome him back to the show. And as if that weren't enough, we've got Richard Glenn Boyer with us as well. Richard is a senior fellow in law and policy at the Center for Cognitive Liberty and Ethics. And he also serves as a director for that organization. Richard has demonstrated a lifelong commitment to freedom of thought and information flow. He's an accomplished attorney. He's been admitted to practice in the United States Supreme Court. It's actually a really interesting story. We'll talk to Richard about it. And filed the first ever freedom of thought brief before the Supreme Court in 2002, just a few years ago. A synopsis of a lot of this stuff can be found on the website. I've got links to all this stuff up. So you can find out much more about both Dennis and Richard by going to MikeHagan.com and getting curious, clicking around a little bit. And so without further delay, Richard, welcome to Radio Orbit. Dennis, welcome back.
Thanks, great to be here.
All right.
Good to be here.
Thank you, as always. Okay, well, gosh, an exciting night for us here, and I couldn't think of a better way to introduce this program to the World Wide Web live. Of course, people listen to the show through the archives for a long time, but this is the first time we've been live, you guys, and I'm so pleased that Dennis, you and Richard could be the ones to share it with us.
Great. Let's hope it works.
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's like we're swimming in the dark right now. So, all right, a couple things out of the way real fast. The website's Dennis, www.hefter.org, Hefter. You can also go to arrowwood.com or arrowwood.org, I guess it is.
Arrowwood.org.
Yeah, .org, and there's an interesting page there with a lot of information and links about Dennis and his brother. Richard website, www.cognitivelibert.org. And Richard also has a website at convictionfree.com. That's his law firm. So, all right. Before we get too busy here, Dennis, the first thing, we spoke a few weeks ago, and I've got a few emails with questions. Everyone was pretty pleased to hear that you had safely secured some of your botanical specimens from South America back here. And I know these things are kind of slow, but at any rate, people are interested if there's any news on that front and sort of what's the latest at Hefter.
Oh, well, as far as the Amazon project, yeah, we were able to get all of our samples out from South America. We're finally getting things hammered out with the Peruvian government as far as permissions to export these things. So we've done that. And now we're sort of in the lab phase of things, and it's kind of slowed down. But basically, we have to work through this 130 samples or so, and make extracts and submit them for screening in the neuroreceptor screens. That my colleague, collaborator on the grant, is Dr. Brian Roth at Case Western. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're doing. It's not tremendously exciting. It's just, we're just cranking through them. The classic grind and bind scenario.
And just looking for something special.
Looking for novel molecular structures that hit a certain range of receptors that we're interested in. That's the key idea.
Okay. All right, so more about that. People, there's some a paper that actually I put up, Dennis, that you wrote a while back from the Peruvian conference in Iquitos that's called The Future of Ayahuasca, and that's up on the website. And, of course, if you go to Hefter, I'm not sure exactly what's there, Dennis, but I'm sure there's certainly some things there they can check out. So
yeah, there's a lot of information about Hefter there. Hefter is, as your listeners probably know, it's a non-profit organization, basically geeks, people like myself, Dave Nichols, Charles Grobe, other either neuroscientists or psychiatrists, or in my case, ethnopharmacologists. And basically, it's a similar organization to MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. We're just much less visible, and I think as a result, much more poorly funded. But our focus is on primarily on clinical research with psychedelics, trying to get these things used for various types of clinical or medical applications.
Okay. So with that taken care of, Richard, thanks for being patient there. And Dennis has been on the program a couple of times, and the listeners are pretty familiar with his work, I think, but you are a little bit more new to the program. So perhaps a little bit of background, the Center for Cognitive Liberty, an interesting title, of course, for those unfamiliar, what it is. We'll have to define cognitive liberty even, I think, maybe where we might start. But tell us a little bit about you and the website and the mission for the Center for Cognitive Liberty and Ethics.
Okay, well, thanks for having me on, and it's an honor to be on with Dennis, whose work I've admired for a long time. But the Center for Cognitive Liberty and Ethics is a nonprofit that was formed in the beginning of the year 2000 to try and look at the way that human rights were going to evolve over the next century and beyond. And what we think is going to happen and what we hope and what we're sort of placing our bets on and helping to usher along is an evolution of human rights which will come to move beyond the rights that have been associated with the body and recognize that there are, in fact, rights associated with the mind and with thinking. And this is very ripe right now in the world of law and in the world of just social policy, because there's, besides psychedelics and entheogens and the whole drug war thing, there's a lot going on with the development of both hard technologies like new forms of deception detectors, kind of lie detectors that read brain waves.
Brain fingerprinting, this whole thing.
Brain fingerprinting and then a whole bunch of pharmaceutical type drugs that affect everything from SSRIs to something like modafinil, which just recently has been looked at as a possible drug to treat cocaine dependence or to help people to kind of come off of cocaine. There's a lot of developments in a range of areas that we think are calling upon the law to fast forward itself and develop explicit protections for what can a person do with their mind, with their brain. How, the brain's clearly related to thought, but yet the law has so far kind of ignored that interface. And so the Center for Cognitive Liberty and Ethics was designed and continues to probe that area and do little projects that we think are going to move things in a direction that we're interested in moving them.
How long have you guys been in operation?
We started in the year 2000, and it just took off like a rocket because that happened to be sort of the end of the dot-com boom, and a lot of the people who had made lots of money at that time really liked this idea and were excited about it and funded it in a way that gave me very unrealistic, grandiose ideas of how easy it would be to fundraise. And
welcome to the real world.
Oh, yeah. The PayPal thing's not working out for me so well,
Yeah, well, I've already decided that's just not my bailiwick, and so now we only do projects that the funding kind of comes very easily because I don't like going around with my hat out and so on and so forth. So that's how it works.
All right, Dennis, how were you introduced to Richard and his work?
Well, I'm not sure exactly. We've been sort of traveling in the same circles for a long time. It was probably one of those infamous Friday night dinners or one of those kinds of things.
Quote-unquote dinners.
Right. Well, no, they were dinners. Excellent, by the way. But I've known of his work for some time, at least since 2000, and I have great admiration for what he's doing because I think this notion of cognitive liberty, he's really cut to the chase here in the sense that the war on drugs and that whole issue is really just a small subset of the issues that he's trying to address, which basically comes down to, freedom of thought. And, it seems to me that there is always, probably throughout history, there's always been this dynamic tension between, the government or the authorities, whether it's the government or religious ecclesiastical authorities or some combination of these, has vested interests in controlling people's behavior and especially what people are thinking. And all of the techniques of propaganda and media that we see brought to bear today are basically being brought to bear to influence how people think.
Right.
But what is different now is that, there are new technologies that are coming on that are in some ways promising and in some ways quite worrisome, because there's, a distinct possibility that, they can exert influence beyond just the sort of old tried and true techniques of propaganda. And Richard has identified this problem and is standing up basically for the freedom to think. You wouldn't think that you'd have to, but apparently we do in this day and age. So, he's taken the lead on this. It's very important work.
Well, Richard, let me ask you a question about that. We talk about human rights all the time, and I think about in this country, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. We name it that, and we have certain rights that are afforded us. The right to practice religion, the right to the freedom of speech, the right to freedom to assemble, all these things, to ask for redress of our grievances, which doesn't work out very well, actually. But where does it talk about freedom of thought?
Well, that, of course, is the problem, is that it doesn't. It's kind of the Zero Amendment. It's the amendment that wasn't mentioned, partly because I think it was kind of unthinkable that there would be some way to really tinker with somebody's thoughts directly, or the government would take such a step to stop people from doing that themselves. And so it wasn't ever written into the Constitution, but it's there because every time you look at any of, not all, but some of the basic rights in the Bill of Rights, like the First Amendment, for instance, just something like freedom of speech, is clearly, the courts have said over and over that the value of this is because we have this marketplace of ideas, and we want to have this open and free, and that's why we allow everybody from the Nazis to the Girl Scouts to, voice their position on topics. Well, obviously, if you can undercut the First Amendment quite easily. Rather than targeting speech, you actually go straight to the thought. If you stop a person from being able to have a particular thought, whether it's by prohibition, which limits people in experiencing certain states of mind that they may not be able to induce in any other very reliable or safe way,
right, or
whether it's actually creating a thought in a person by making them take a drug, which the courts will do it sometimes. So the idea of cognitive liberty, it kind of underlies a lot of the fundamental rights we already recognize. Another one is, of course, the right to privacy, which is not mentioned in the Constitution, but it's been recognized as a fundamental right.
Mm-hmm.
And most people conceive of thought right now, at least its genesis, as being an interior thing to the individual. And so the right to privacy, or the right to not be subjected to unreasonable searches.
Right, the Fourth Amendment comes close.
Fourth Amendment. These are rights that when you kind of cut below the rhetoric of them, what they're doing is they're protecting interior spaces, whether it's inside of a house or the inside of an envelope or inside of a briefcase. And the theory that sort of underlies them, the basic principles, fit and would speak to the same right to think of the head or your skull or your brain as an interior space that deserves a type of protection that requires a great deal by the government before it can just kind of come in there and change the way you're using your brain.
Right. I mean, the whole idea of freedom of speech, for example, I mean, it seems sort of intuitive, but really not. But, I mean, of course, you have to be able to have the thought.
Well, that was the whole thing
in
like
order
Orwell.
To make the speech.
When Orwell, wrote, there's this, the idea there was in 1984 was controlling language. It wasn't about, old speak and new speak. New speak wasn't to really, they didn't care about controlling language. Over and over, the government in that novel controlled language for the purpose of restricting thought. And so there's just no doubt that First Amendment's not about the paper and the ink. It's about the underlying thoughts, and that's where now the courts need to start to kind of fast forward themselves on what's really at stake here, because so far they've done a terrible job at kind of getting up to speed on these issues.
Amazing. Now, so Dennis, you're sort of on the other side of, not really on the other side of the issue, but you're involved in development and research of some of the things that Richard is talking about here. Now, how does this fit in with the work that you're doing? And
you mean the drugs to treat schizophrenia?
Yes, the stuff that you're working on with the grant from Hefter.
Well, sure. I mean, I don't think that you can arrest these technologies. You know, pharmaceutical technologies are going to be developed. Other types of neural technologies are going to be developed. I was just reading something before I came down here in the Otney Reader about some of these brain implant machines that they're now using. Originally they were used to treat Parkinson's, and now they're being adapted to things like obsessive-compulsive disorder.
Amazing.
You know, and they have helped people. I mean, I think the key thing here, all of these technologies are going to be available. There's really no way that we could stop them. But a technology in and of itself is not, evil or good. It's the uses to which it's put. Right,
the wisdom behind it.
And I think the key thing here is the issue of coercion. If a person has, say, schizophrenia or obsessive-compulsive disorder and perceives that as a problem and wants to be treated, if it's their choice to be treated, then I'm fine with it. It's when government steps in and says, it's not your choice. We're going to force the treatment on you. And Richard has argued, I think, a couple of cases in this respect. There was one previous case, which I'm sure you can tell us about, in which a person basically stopped taking their medications and as a result was psychotic, and because they were psychotic couldn't be tried for the crime alleged that they committed. And the government wanted to implement procedures to force the person to take their medication so that they could then, and it's the issue of choice. It's the same issue that comes up with abortion. Nobody is forced to get an abortion, but what the government wants to do is to take the element of choice away. They want to, speaking to this issue of privacy, it's all about control, and the uterus is a private space as well, and, a woman should say what's done with that.
I agree with you, Dennis.
And it's very much the same issue. It's all about, how these technologies are going to be applied. I mean, I think it's great that we have neuroimaging technologies now that can examine brain states in fairly fine resolution. We can use them on Tibetan monks. Maybe we can understand a little more about what mystical states of mind are and psychedelic states of mind and that sort of thing. But when you come to the point where, for example, you can't step on an airplane without undergoing a brain scan, then I think we have to be very careful. And we're not there yet, but give it 5 years.
Interesting. Yeah, there's actually I'm on the web right now, you guys, and I'm looking at a story that I found a couple weeks ago, and it had to do with this organization that calls themselves TerraSem, the TerraSem movement. But, Richard, this is something that I thought might interest you, but check this out. It says, the TerraSem movement has posted online streaming videos of a moot court hearing on the petition of a conscious computer to be treated as a legal person. A moot court hearing is a legal role-playing exercise conducted by real lawyers and judges in preparation for anticipated actual judiciatory proceedings. So there's also a technological side of this whole thing, too, that we haven't even talked about yet.
Actually, yeah, the TerraSound people are really interesting. I'm going to be out there for a little gathering, I think it's in July, on nanotechnology and neurotechnology coming together, which are both things I don't know a whole lot about, but it's going to be an interesting scene, I think. So there are groups now that are beginning to facilitate a discussion in this area, and I think that it is moving ahead in a way that it will generate some degree of kind of wise policy making at some point. The kind of the problem that I see, in which I lose sleep over sometimes when I get really neurotic about it, is that the legal system is part of what's with psychedelics or with some of the other technologies that have been controlled in the past. That's been difficult is that they don't interface well with the legal system. And so to me the question has been for a long time, like, what is it that's strange about these things that just in the same way that I think Dennis looks at the way that these drugs can affect the human system, I'm kind of been looking at the way they affect the legal system. And what I'm finding there is that the system that I'm engaged in, which is the law, has a built-in bias to be conservative. That's what law is about, is to make the world predictable in the future. And when you decide a case, when a judge is looking to determine what to do, they actually look back in time to precedent, and they don't look for it. It's not a system that's based on imagination. It's a system that's based much more on memory, or it's more on habit than novelty. It's more on locking down things. And whereas science and technology is just the opposite. Its goal is to push forward and unfold the future. And so when you have when you have the legal system actually kind of having a certain degree of steering over this thing by saying what's legal and what's not with regard to people using these things, you're coming into something that's biased in a direction that's going to impede the development of science in a way that I think we've seen with psychedelics since the 50s and the 60s, and which we could see very much so in the next few decades with respect to other technologies.
But I think impeding. I'm all for science and pushing the envelope, but I do think that what Richard said about wise policy making. This is the thing, and this is what the legal system can help us do, is to formulate wise policy. And God knows we need to do that. If we had formulated wise policy, for example, with energy 30 years ago, we knew what the issues were. We knew what the problems were going to be, but we didn't deal with it, and now we're in a heap of shit. Am I allowed to say that?
Heck yeah, why not?
You know,
we're only talking to the whole world, Dennis. So,
but you know what I mean. So there's this dynamic tension, sort of, between the need to proceed cautiously with things like cloning, for example, all these neurotechnologies, psychopharmacology, and with respect to psychopharmacology, I would say, it's not the illegal drugs that we need to be worried about. It's the corporate drugs. And because those are the tools that the control society can use to essentially control what people can think. Very much in the sort of Brave New World thing, a gram is better than a dam. That was the motto. And so, we need to wisely regulate these things, but I think we've shown time and again that outright prohibition doesn't work. It certainly doesn't work with drugs.
Yeah, well, Dennis, it seems like that the point that I get from both of you in this first segment here is that there are two sides to all of these things, whether it's technological or pharmacological. They can be used for great benefit, perhaps. In other words, maybe there's reason to be really excited about some of this stuff, but at the same time, there's the other polarity of it.
They can be used for great benefit or for great harm, and it depends on who's using them, and for what purposes. And given, the current political climates and what is going on, it's worrisome because, if you could have a belief in a, compassionate, wise leaders that could be trusted to use these things in a wise way, then we wouldn't worry. But in fact, it's quite the opposite. You can pretty much assume that, that the uses to which these technologies are going to be put will probably not be for the greater good. They'll probably be for the consolidation of power in the hierarchies that already possess it. Okay. This is the scary part.
All right, you guys. Well, look, that's a chance here to take a break, okay? So we're going to play a piece of music here. We'll come back, and Richard, I want to talk a little bit more about. We'll continue along the same line. Maybe you can talk about some of the legal cases that you've run across that are dealing with these exact issues. Maybe some of the ones that we're doing well in. In other words, I'd like to talk about the UDV case at the Supreme Court. To me, that was a stunner, and then maybe, I don't know, just some successes and failures. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that when we come back, all right?
I'd be happy to.
All right, there you have it. As I said, this is Mike. You're listening to Radio Orbit. It's about 11:43 on Monday evening. It's the 1st of May. It's May Day, and we're live with Dr. Dennis McKenna and Richard Glenn Boyer from the Center for Cognitive Liberty and Ethics. And, Richard, I'd like to ask you real quick if you could just sort of give us an update, like we talked about before the break, about some of the cases that you've run across. And then everyone here was screaming at me at the break that for me to shut my mouth and to let them ask you guys some questions. So I think we're going to start doing that right after we hear that from you. Okay.
Okay. Well, that's a tough. I guess.
What about the UDV case? Maybe we could start with that. I thought that was an interesting one.
Well, that's one that is, there was a victory in, and that's in no small part due to Dennis's work and his colleagues at the Hefter Institute and elsewhere. That's a case that involves a church in Brazil that uses well, actually, maybe Dennis should talk about what's involved in the church, and then I can talk about the legal side of it.
That would be great.
Okay, well, the UDV, which is short for the União de Vegetal, I'm not sure I'm saying it right. It's a Brazilian sect, I guess you could call it, about 10,000 members that uses ayahuasca, which is the Amazonian hallucinogenic beverage that's very important basically throughout the Amazon basin. But a few decades ago, I should say, there were several syncretic churches that were formed in Brazil that use it in a very non-traditional way. In the traditional way, it's basically a classic shamanic psychedelic. They use it much more like a sacrament, similar to the way the Native American church uses peyote. And they've been going in Brazil for, the UDV really since the early 70s. And then there's another other large religion there called the Santo Daime that's been around since the 30s. Okay. And they use this thing as a sacrament, basically. And
where do they get the leaves and the vines, Dennis?
Well, they grow the plants and they make it.
Okay. Right.
And so they use it very much in a sacramental way. And then in 93 or thereabouts, they incorporated a chapter in the United States called in Santa Fe. They incorporated a U.S. chapter, incorporated as a church, and everything was fine. They were practicing their religion. And then in the summer of 1999, if I recall, they were raided by the DEA, and their sacrament was seized, about 50 gallons of it. And Richard, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I don't believe anyone was charged. They just seized it, and they said, well, you might be charged with distributing a controlled substance. The crux of that is that of these plants, one of the components contains DMT. The plants themselves are not illegal. But DMT is a controlled substance, a controlled Schedule I substance.
Which happens to occur in all of our brains, by the way.
That's right, and everywhere else. It's in thousands of plants,
right.
Hundreds that we know of, and probably thousands more that we don't. But it was the UDV that actually sued the government under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, as it turned out, and basically said, give us our sacrament back. You have no right to interfere with this. And that started this legal proceeding that ended up in the Supreme Court. So that's the sort of the ethnobotanical side of it. Richard could tell you much better than I about the legal ins and outs about it.
Please do, Richard.
Well, the good news is the outcome of the case, which was decided. Wow, I can't. I would guess it was earlier this year.
In February.
Was a victory for the church members, which is relatively unheard of in American law, to have a religious defense in a way worth to a drug case. But that's key in this situation, as Dennis mentioned, that the church didn't, when this was seized by customs, when the tea was seized by customs and shown to contain the Schedule I drug DMT, the church didn't sit there and kind of hum and haw until the government came knocking with a criminal complaint. What they did is they actually sued the government, and that changes a lot of the way that the burden of proof works in a legal system, and it also just changes the underlying way that judges see the parties in the case. And so, based on a law that was passed in 1993, the church argued that the continued retention, the continued detention of their tea by the government was impinging upon their religious freedoms as recognized in this law in 1993. And for a number of reasons which are very kind of narrow and particular to the church, for instance, the fact that there's only about 130 members in the United States at this point, and the fact that the drug is a very esoteric drug, ayahuasca, or the church calls it huasca. Certainly not a drug that's contributing to any of the ills that are typically part of the government rhetoric against drugs.
Right, not a lot of money involved in it for anyone.
I don't know if there's any money to speak of.
Not for the UTV, I don't think, yeah.
And for sort of these reasons and a few others, the court in this case felt pretty confident, saying, hey, you know what, these people have a right to do this. They're not harming anybody else. And I think key to this was that one of the issues the government brought up was they're harming themselves. These guys are taking a drug that's very dangerous. And I think it was, by and large, Dennis's work in this, which he has been doing for, I don't know how long, 2 decades, I think.
3, 4.
More like 4.
Yeah.
But
4 decades on ayahuasca, that, at a time when, A, this was not very many people knew about this, but B, there's political implications for him as a scientist to be working on something like this.
Right.
But because he kind of pushed on through and did this work, there was actually some studies and evidence that the church was able to bring forward that showed that it wasn't that there wasn't any clear evidence, or at least the evidence was in balance between whether this was actually causing them any harm or actually doing them any good physically.
Yeah,
and so the court,
maybe I could speak to that a little bit, Richard. I'm not taking credit for this because there was a large team of people that worked on this, but we had a track record with the UTV because in 1993 I was invited and my colleagues were invited by them. They held a conference in Sao Paulo in 1991 to which we were invited, and basically they sprung on us the notion that they wanted to do a biomedical study of ayahuasca, and they had a scientific agenda. They were actually curious about it, but they also had a political agenda because at the time they were negotiating with the Brazilian regulatory agencies, an agency called CONFIN, which is kind of a combination of the DEA and the FDA. They handle in Brazil both illegal drugs and the medicinal drugs. And they were trying to convince Confen that it was okay, that it wasn't a health problem or a drug abuse problem. So they needed some outside investigators, preferably some Americans, to come in and do a biomedical study. So they were basically willing to throw the whole thing open to us and let us come in and do whatever we wanted to do EEG, do blood samples, do psychological screening,
so valuable stuff,
psychiatric evaluations, and all this stuff. So we did that and published that. There's been a number of papers that have come out, but the bottom line was that, there was no evidence that the drug was harmful to all of our subjects had been in the UDV at least 10 years, which means that they'd been taking ayahuasca on average, or Huasca as they call it, on average once every 2 weeks. We did psychological testing. We found they actually performed better than the control group on, tests for verbal recall and memory and cognitive functions and personality traits and all this stuff. No evidence of physical harm. So there was, in a sense, it wasn't a clinical study. It was an observational study. But there was this body of data that showed that, not only is the drug not harmful, it was probably very helpful to this group in the context in which they used it. Because probably the most telling thing from our point of view, a lot of these people who had joined the UDV were pretty dysfunctional when they joined. Alcoholism, drug abuse, domestic violence, all this kind of stuff, which is actually fairly common in Brazilian society, I guess any society, but it had turned everybody around. I mean, they were so straight-laced, they didn't even use tobacco, and so they all felt that it was very good for them. It saved them. Right. Hard to separate that variable from the context in which it's used, but anyway, that was their perception. So we were able to, I was on the sidelines in this case. I was an advisor behind the scenes, but my colleague, especially Charles Grove, did testify quite a bit before the judges trying this case. So we were able to sort of trot this body of data forward, and we were able to say there's no evidence that it's physically harmful.
Dennis, was there any historical evidence brought forward? In other words, the long-term use of these things, via shamanism and those sort of traditions?
Well, I mean, that body of data is out there, but we didn't use that much in the case because we had the data for the UDV. Right. And the way they use it is so different than the shamanic use. It's almost like, they are the same drug, but the context of their use is so different. It's very much like the Native American church.
Okay. All right. Richard, really quickly, what's it mean? What's the decision mean?
Oh, that's a good question. It depends. For people who are use things, anybody who's not in the UDV, it means that...
Join the UDV.
Well, yeah, this is a narrow decision it's decided on its facts, and so it really protects those people, and there's no way to expand this. You'd have to do a lot of work to expand it, and I think that will have to be done gradually. Let's say a Rastafarian, they're going to have a big uphill battle, even with this decision, to argue that they ought to be able to use cannabis for religious purposes, primarily because everything is kind of inverted for something like marijuana, where it's this ayahuasca is an esoteric drug, marijuana is something that's widespread. The UDV had 130 members in the U.S.
I wonder, though, Richard, something that I've wondered about now with this decision in place, it should be fairly easy for the Santo Daime to come along and say, we're a legitimate religion. We've been around even longer than the UDV, and we have even more members in Brazil. What they don't have in the States, there are a lot of Daime, cults, or a lot of members of the Daime in the States, in different parts of the States, but they don't seem to have quite the same organizational infrastructure that the UDV does.
Yeah, well, I agree. I think that they would be the next in line to kind of expand this just a little bit more to cover their members. I think there's going to be...
You would think they'd be preparing the case.
Well, I mean, there was the political issues involved, even in this case, where the Santo Daime wanted to have a greater voice in the case and were, in some sense, pushed to the side.
Right.
And that's just the way that these cases work. It is legally, it doesn't make sense for the UDV members to want to argue a principle any broader than necessary to protect themselves.
Sure.
But, yes, I agree that now the Santo Daime should come along and make their arguments, and I think that there will be a progression where other individuals and also organizations try to go in the same direction, and it will be interesting to see what the court does. It's definitely opened the door from where it was prior to this case. I mean, the last case that the U.S. Supreme Court decided that involved the religious use of entheogenic drug was the Smith case in 1990, which was a horrible, horrible case that I'm not being hyperbolic when I say it literally destroyed freedom of religion as it's protected in the Constitution.
Wow.
But isn't that why the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was actually passed?
Exactly. So that's what led to, in 1993, the passage of the law that the UDV was able to gain its protections under. So any argument from here on isn't about the First Amendment, because that's been canned or put on hold until the court somehow works its way around to making a different holding on that. And instead it's brought under this statute. And arguments that are fundamental, like the right to practice your religion, while you're going to use anything you can to argue it, and, a federal statute's a pretty good thing, it's still not as good as being able to argue under the United States Constitution, where I think is the right place for this right to be kind of articulated and protected. But so what it means for others is we'll have to wait and see. If there's a light now that's out shining, and it's going to take other people to sort of be able to step into it to see, for sure what the future will hold in this area.
But people shouldn't. What I'm getting from what you're saying is you can't go out and found an ad hoc religion. It's not going to get you anywhere if you suddenly find the first church of methadone or something.
That's exactly right. It's really a tough thing, because the whole there isn't. Theoretically, under the principles of our laws, our freedom of religion isn't supposed to depend on whether you're a member of a 1,000-year-old religion or a very modern religion that was just founded. There's many prophets that have come along, and these people are entitled to their protections. But in this area, when you bring up drugs and religion, it's a really touchy area. My theory is that it's partly because what's called the war on drugs is, like Dennis was saying earlier, really a war on the way that people think. And I would go further to say it's actually a religious war itself. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the way the laws are, the theory of the law is about, it's an exoteric system in which the truth is determined by going out and consulting a book. You go out and read the codes, you read the Constitution. Mm. That's identical in its methodology to these book-based religions where you consult the Bible to know what the truth is.
And that may be one thing that helped the UDV in this case, because they are definitely a highly structured, hierarchical, top-down organization. They have a doctrine, they have books, they have a certain thing you have to do to be a member in good standing. You have to study the doctrine, and if you want to advance in the organization, you have to go through levels, just like any other, any formal religion. I mean, they are a formal religion under every sense of the word.
I think that's a super important point. One of the things that courts have done over the last 70 years when they've been in the American system looking at this issue of drugs and religion is whenever they want to decide against the person who is using this or that drug, what they'll do is they'll characterize that person's use of the drug not as a religion. They'll say, this isn't a religion. What this is your personal philosophy. And a personal philosophy isn't entitled to First Amendment protections. And so I think the UDV, there wasn't any doubt. Nobody could contest the fact that, hey, this is a religion. It looks like a religion. It follows all the typical rules of how the law thinks of a religion. And that issue, which is a big one in a lot of these cases, just wasn't there for the government to try and exploit.
All right, you guys, look, let me do a quick ID here. It's KOPN Columbia, 89.5 FM. My name is Mike Hagan. You're listening to RadiOrbit. My guests are Dr. Dennis McKenna and Richard Glenn Boyer. And you can find information about all of us on the web at www.mikehagan.com. And let's continue. You guys, we've got a whole bunch of people chomping at the bit here. And I'm going to switch gears a little bit and bring in some of our guests in the studio here. Right now we've got a young man whose name is Jesse. And so, Jesse, I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Dennis and to Richard.
Yes. And Dennis and Richard, thank you very, very much for gracing us with your presence.
Glad to be here, wherever here is.
It's everywhere tonight, Dennis.
It's
right,
everywhere.
So it is.
I was recruited by Mike to ask some pertinent questions, and earlier this evening I was actually watching network TV. I won't say which network, but there's this constant parade of ads from pharmaceutical companies, one after the other, trying to sell you on drugs to treat anything, from chronic constipation to acid reflux to PMS, anything.
To man problems.
Treating the symptoms and not the root of the problem itself. Now, maybe you guys can clarify this. I have heard, and I'm sorry I haven't done more research on this topic, but ayahuasca has, correct me if I'm wrong, been used quite successfully and adopted by, I believe, the Venezuelan government and a couple other places to treat chronic alcoholism and opium and heroin addiction with quite a huge success rate.
Well, yes and no. I think it's Peru.
Peru.
There's not a lot of ayahuasca going on, but in Peru is sort of the hotbed of the shamanic use. And there are a couple of clinics in Peru that are using ayahuasca to treat alcoholism and cocaine addiction and that sort of thing. A place called Takiwasi, run by a physician named Jacques Mabit, a French guy, is kind of at the cutting edge of all that work. If you look at, in our UDV study, if you look at these folks that we studied, these 15 men, we did structured psychiatric interviews with them, and they all basically told the same story, which was that they were either alcoholics or drug addicts or both. And when they joined the UDV, their initial experiences were quite terrifying, but they basically turned them around. And they sort of saw where their lives were going, and they determined to change, and they did so successfully. What's lacking here, in a way, is that these are real-world situations. We didn't do a clinical trial, and it wasn't a clinical trial in the sense that clinical trials are done here. For a long time, I've argued that we really need to do a clinical trial. We need to jump through all these regulatory hoops.
Are there any concrete numbers on what the success rate is with this sort of therapy and this sort of treatment with ayahuasca?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, that's the thing. That's what's lacking. There aren't concrete numbers. There are no well-controlled trials, and so what there is rumor and anecdote and not to be dismissed. I think that it probably is very good in the right context for doing that. But what is lacking is any kind of, definitive clinical study that mainstream medicine would accept. And, for a long time I was advocating that we should do this, that we should try and get a clinical study going in the United States specifically to treat alcoholism, because that seemed like the most obvious, first application. I've sort of come away from that notion, actually.
We talked about that last time you were on the air, Dennis.
Yeah. Maybe it's partly a result of beating my head against the wall for 5 years and getting nowhere with the government. In order to initiate a clinical trial in this country, you have to do what's with an experimental drug. You have to file an IND.
Right.
What's called an investigational new drug application, and you have to meet certain criteria. Well, the fact that ayahuasca is, number one, a controlled substance, which they really don't like.
Is it a Schedule 1 right now?
Well, DMT
is.
DMT.
Is that analogous? Is that part of the analog?
DMT's in it. That's the
DMT
active agent.
Oh, okay.
And the question of whether the plants are illegal because DMT is in one of the plants is up for grabs. I maintain they're not. They never have been, but I'm sure others would disagree with me. But we, the thing is, it's a scheduled substance, and it's a botanical preparation, and those are kind of the two things that the FDA really hates to deal with. They don't like botanical drugs, and they certainly don't like botanical drugs containing controlled substances.
Dennis,
so the bar is really high to get an IND approved.
Both Dennis and Richard, this is relevant here. There's a note that just came across on the chat room, and a gentleman says, Richard Boyer, could you please comment on if we could bring a case against the U.S. government about the molecule dimethyltryptamine in every human's brain? In other words, even the judges are carrying,
Yeah, that's
fascinating idea.
That's something that I've kind of thought around the edges about and haven't focused too much on. The way that the laws, it's a kind of a tricky thing, because right now there are laws that outlaw the possession of certain drugs, and there are also laws that outlaw the use of certain drugs, and there are laws that outlaw being under the influence of certain drugs. And right now, possession...
You're violating all of those.
Yeah. It's a big party.
Everybody is.
Everyone is.
Oh, my gosh. How crazy is this world?
But there are little wrinkles to each one of those offenses that kind of fall apart or don't really apply to endogenous drugs. I mean, you made in your own body. So I think that would be something that would be a little too smart for the courts to kind of grapple with.
They couldn't get it, huh?
Yeah, I think there's a better argument. Like Dennis did some consulting on the UDV case. I did some early on also, and my little piece of the puzzle was to put together the argument that ayahuasca wasn't a scheduled substance because it's just not scheduled, and neither are the two plants that make it. And so that argument was put together and tried in the federal district court, and that court rejected the argument. But I think it's a valid argument, and that's like kind of a one area that I think will get further play depending on what happens in this case and other cases. And the other thing that Dennis was saying, or the other thing that came to mind while Dennis was talking, was that one of the things I find frustrating about the way that our system is designed to control drugs is that it only examines a drug through the lens of its medical use, whereas up until, I don't know, the last 100 years, every society, all people had recognized, I think, that drugs aren't just medicines, but they have many, many other uses. And yet our society has decided that this is the one and only use, and if you can't prove a drug's efficacy and safety with respect to its identity as a medicine, then it can't possibly become any kind of legitimate part of our society. And I think that's something that in the long term should change.
And I think that's going to change. I think it is changing. And I think that probably the pharmaceutical industry is going to lead the charge in some ways, because they perceive, I mean, where do you cross the line between remediation or amelioration of some condition and enhancement?
I agree with you. I think that also the driver for something like that is monetary, in that the pharmaceutical companies will realize that, I'm sure they have already, no doubt that they have, that, why do they want to participate in a market structure in which their only customers are the percentage of Americans or others who are actually been diagnosed with some illness, when in fact, if they can break that barrier and market something to
the other 90%,
of us, then hey,
if there's a buck to be made, you can be sure that it will be changed.
Of course.
I mean, it's already happened.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Viagra and these sorts of things are good examples. I mean, you can't tell me that 40% of the male population of the country has erectile dysfunction. I think we're in trouble if they do. So this is a lifestyle drug.
Wow.
I mean, it's purely and simply a lifestyle drug, and the pharmaceutical industry has become very creative at
making up diseases.
Yes, they will invent a drug, and then the syndrome that the drug treats is soon to follow.
And I think that pretext is only going to be around for so much longer. For instance, modafinil,
What's
one
that?
of the interesting. It's I don't know the pharmacology, but Dennis can speak to that. But the quick point I want to make is that when that drug first came out, it was okayed by the FDA for treating narcolepsy.
Right.
And then they expanded that, I guess it was last year sometime, to treat a disease that they created, I think, called shift worker sleep disorder.
Right.
Wow, I got that, I think, you guys. It's, 12:15? Oh, my God. Oh, man.
Yeah,
well,
so
amazing.
That's definitely true. They're expanding these applications for these things.
Wow.
They're very creative at thinking up. Or just look at SSRIs. I mean, SSRIs originally were pretty much for depression.
Dennis, for the people who don't know what the acronym is.
The Prozac type antidepressants, the so-called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors.
Okay.
What that stands for. And originally they were brought out to treat depression, but now they're being used to treat depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, sometimes even to help people quit smoking, all sorts of other things.
All right, you guys, it is 12:15. We're going to take another break. We'll come back. We've got a question from Bob. We've got Kyle, but we'll go age before beauty. And then, but Mandy, who's the lovely young lady in here with us, if she's ready to talk, we'll bring in her. We'll bring her in as well. So, anyway, Dennis and Richard, thanks, you guys. Stick around. We'll have some more music here that'll keep you awake. Okay.
All right.
One more time. That's ISM, and this is Mike Hagan. You're listening to RadiOrbit. My guests are Richard Glenn Bohr and Dr. Dennis McKenna. We're having an interesting conversation about drug laws and pharmacology and technology, and let's get back to it here. So, guys, first, thanks for sticking around with us.
I'm happy to be here.
We're still hanging.
All right, I know. All right, Dennis, you're no old geezer. You told me you're an old geezer, and you're no old geezer. You'll be up all night, I think. So.
Older than you.
Well, everyone else here is younger than me. Actually, no, we got people older than you here too. We got Bob who's gonna talk next. All right, look, we're all talking age. How old are you, Bob?
69.
Oh, hold on. I should turn on your damn microphone. All right, there you go.
Yeah, I'm almost 70.
Almost 70. So Bob Bolt.
Okay, and you're still awake. That's good.
Oh yeah, I'm revving. Got the coffee going.
All right, Bob, you got a question for Richard or Dennis?
Yeah, actually, this is a little more for Richard. I'm curious as to how optimistic you are about our chance of actually affecting change socially, politically for cognitive liberty. If so, where where do we, the people, where do we fit into this? What kind of political activity?
Where do we direct our efforts or something?
Yeah, in terms of activism.
That's a great question, and actually my thinking on it is totally dependent on my neurochemistry at any given moment. There's times where I think it's going to happen in the next instant, and then there's times which tend to actually be longer in duration where I'm very pessimistic about it. So right now I'm kind of on a little bit of an uptick because of the UDV decision. And how it's going to come about is a really tough. I kind of, part of when the Center for Cognitive Liberty and Ethics was really running strong in 2000, 2001, 2002, there was, people who wanted to do campus organizations that were going to, educate people and help think these things out. And there was activists who were getting in the streets and putting up posters that said, give me my cognitive liberty. And I just kind of felt myself to be incompetent at designing social change or movements or anything on that order. And so I'm afraid that I think it's, you have to do anything you can do. But how it's going to happen or what's going to lead to the putting the point on this thing is kind of, I think, anybody's guess. And it may be that the change in this area, on one hand, I think it's going to come about gradual. Everybody's doing their part, and little by little it changes. And then, on the other hand, I kind of have another part of myself that thinks that it's going to come about much more like a kaleidoscope in the way that something may bump this system and a whole other pattern just pops into existence. That's happened in other times in the legal system, and it may happen here if there's a new drug that's developed or a different technology that, for instance, one thing could be that if somebody figured out a way, and this is just wild thinking, but if somebody figured, just like Dennis was saying, that DMT is everywhere, and a lot of these other drugs are also everywhere, although they're scheduled. What if somebody was able to create something like a common grass or a weed that could produce THC or some other commonly used scheduled drug? I think that something like that a technological change like that could immediately change the way that the government perceives its ability to control these things. And no one can really predict that, although I'm told people are working on that.
I'm sure they are.
Well, it's interesting that that you should come up with that idea. It's not only about drugs. All of these issues go way beyond drugs, but a lot of these issues have focused on drugs because that's sort of the crux in a way of this cognitive liberty thing. We're talking in some sense about people's right to form alliances with plants, and partly I would say that's my answer to this. In the sense, it's interesting while this whole process was going on with the UDV and the Supreme Court, at the same time, people are free to, DMT is in all kinds of plants.
Right.
Beta-carbolines are in all kinds of plants. That technology, the idea of introducing the gene for, say, DMT into a common grass, the common grass is already out there. There's thousands of, potentially there are hundreds of plants that contain DMT that we know about, and that's only because people have bothered to look. So, in fact, there are probably thousands. And that's one of the ways that we can fight back, I think. I think it's interesting. We can enlist the plants almost as allies in this fight for cognitive liberty.
That's right, Dennis.
We're free, and it's almost like a slow kind of bioterrorism. Although I don't like the term terrorism because we're not terrorizing anybody, we're not killing anybody, unlike the dominator government. But, we can fight back that way. We don't have to create huge infrastructures and cartels for manufacture and distribution of pharmaceutical drugs. We can simply, over generations, propagate plants, exchange plants, give them to your friends, give seeds away, transmit the knowledge of how to prepare these things and how to use them in a good life-affirming way. And I think gradually you can reach out to hearts and minds, and you can actually change societies that way. But it's a slow process. It works itself out over generations, not in a few years.
Dennis, you said to me one time in an email when I was frustrated about a decision that had been made in a court actually in England with regard to the psilocybin with Stropharia cubensis.
Right.
And you said, well, Mike, they've got all the media and they've got the guns and they've got the power and the money, but we've got the plants.
We've got the plants. and that makes all the difference.
You're damn right it does. And so, all right, Bob, I think has a follow-up here.
Just another thing that makes me very optimistic about it is the concept of the Internet, which has given a whole power to sort of micro demographics, I guess you would say it, where there's a real attempt now to control the Internet and to
they ain't controlling us, baby. We're doing it right now.
But the way they did with broadcasting, they really destroyed broadcasting in many respects. I mean, like KLPN is a little island of sanity in this whole sea of commercialism. But the Internet, I think, it resists the temptation, or resists the power structure to desire to control it. Because as soon as they find some way to control it, people sort of revolve around it. It's like a wonderful virus or something.
It's like a brain. It's like a neural network.
Yeah, and what Dennis said about the developing these alternative networks for distribution and for understanding, that sort of thing. This is kind of stuff that can slip in under the radar of the attempts to control it. So that's a very optimistic thing. I'm happy to have heard that.
Yeah, it is. It's an optimistic view, but it's also a view that calls for patience. I think you have to take the long term. I mean, people have always had these alliances with plants. That goes back as far as you care to look back, and governments come and go, laws come and go, civilizations rise and fall, but people maintain their relationship with nature. The thing that worries me a little bit is that the entrenched power structures have become so powerful and so destructive, we now actually have to worry about the destruction of nature. And if they get that going, well, we won't have to worry about much of anything.
All right, Dennis, thanks. Okay, let's see. Kyle over here in the corner, my friend Kyle. Kyle Cook.
I'm just curious.
Whoa, hold on. I did it again. I got to turn the mic on there.
Hello.
All right, there we go. This is Kyle and Dennis and Richard.
First of all, I'd like to thank you guys for being with us. I'm only 21 years of age, so I'm kind of ill-informed compared to everyone else. But, you got to start somewhere. My first kind of unanswerable question is you're talking about the dominating government, and we have been a lot. And I think we can agree that most of the people who make the decisions as far as what we can and can't do are the same ones who agree that God created this entire earth that we live on, our universe. And my first question is, did God make a mistake putting all these things all over the planet for us to find? Okay. And my second question is, how successful would the war on drugs be if we called it the war on nature? But kind of a real question for either one of you.
No more rhetorical questions.
Okay. Right. I gotta bring it all down to earth for a second here, because these are the things that come into my brain. But anyways, as far as pharmaceutical companies and lobbyists go, how much money gets poured into campaigns from these pharmaceutical companies, and how does that influence decisions on what is legal and illegal? And if that does influence to a greater degree, why is lobbying legal?
Richard.
You're
welcome, Dennis.
Yeah, that's...
No, I've had my say. Weigh in on that one.
I don't know the numbers, but there's no question that pharmaceutical companies are powerful politically. What the numbers are, who knows? But
huge.
there's no question about that. That's why I think that if the so-called battle is framed and only framed as it's the plants versus the pharmaceutical companies, that's a tough fight.
Oh man.
If though the pharmaceutical companies come to see some interests that are in parallel with what the plant people also see, then we've got a battering ram that's going to come through the door of the White House. But it's those are kind of questions where, like you said when you spoke them, they can't really. I certainly can't answer them. And the war on drugs is, as you mentioned, a war on nature, not just nature. The plants and the trees and the animals, but human nature.
Right. Again, back to cognitive liberty, Richard.
And so it's this is what the government's been very successful about. Is when they talk about the war on drugs, people don't question that rhetoric and instead lap it up. When in fact it's similar to saying that the war on censure, that banning books and the attempt to suppress ideas in print. That was not a war on paper and ink, and nobody would have fallen for that. People would have said, "Bullshit! That's a war on trying to stop me from reading other thoughts and getting different ideas that the government, for some reason, is afraid of." And I think it's the same thing with the so-called war on drugs. That's a misnomer. It's a complete red herring that gets people focused on these little pills and plants and powders when what's really at stake here is what form of consciousness are you permitted to have, and who is going to say what's right and what's wrong, and in a way kind of build like a Berlin Wall that's inside your mind, and you cannot go to beyond it.
Right.
And I think that's what is being faced here, and getting people, I think, to kind of back up or walk beyond the way that the government has framed this, and using millions of dollars and media power, they've been able to do this very successfully. But I think that the internet is a hope, and in small ways, this kind of knowledge of these plants and what their potentials are and ways to use them has a remarkable staying power, and it's been passed from human to human over eons.
Right. Thousands.
And like Dennis says, I think that clearly in the long run, it has to. If it doesn't win, then it's darkness and doom. But how long that will take is like kind of what the battle is about, I think. Right.
I mean, I think we can take heart in the fact that the war on drugs is a miserable failure. As some wags said, the war on drugs is over, and drugs won.
Yeah.
Dennis, one of the funniest things that was responded about the last time you were on the air with Stephen Buhner was you made this amazing comment about how essentially we are bags of drugs. We're just these enzymes.
We're made of drugs.
Right, and so and as we've been talking about tonight, many of them exist in our own metabolism, et cetera, that are considered illegal for silly political reasons or whatever, but it becomes outrageous.
Right. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it's part of the disinformation strategy of the dominators that they sort of demonize these completely. I mean, it's absurd to make a war on drugs. You're not making a war on drugs. Wars are not waged on drugs any more than wars are waged against terror. The whole concept is absurd. There's no such thing as a war on terror. Terror is a tactic. You can't wipe it out any more than you can, wipe out the entire spectrum of species. There's always a tendency to sort of to set up to demonize these things, drugs, terror, whatever. Wars are made on people, and the war on drugs is largely a war against our own citizens. The war on terror is a war
of terror.
Of terror, in a sense. I mean, not that terrorists, I'm not defending terrorists, but terrorists are people that have a beef for one reason or another, legitimate or not, and they choose that tactic because in a lot of cases no other no other recourse is open to them. It's a way of getting people's attention. Maybe if we would spend more time wondering, why are these people so pissed off? And what could we do to make them not so pissed off? But that might actually be a solution, you know, and I don't think that the government's really interested in a solution. They're interested in perpetuating what some have called the military-industrial complex. You can add different things into the hyphenation, the military, prison, pharmaceutical, industrial complex.
University.
So, you know, it's all about entrenched power structures wanting to preserve their power and rationalize it, and sloganeering, and this, you know, this war on drugs. Well, no, war on what drugs?
Right.
Which drugs?
But again, it's this use of language that is so manipulative.
Right.
All right, look.
It's called propaganda.
That's right. It's propaganda. It's an old story. So, all right, look. Here's one from the web, you guys. Richard, please ask Richard about the current state of subliminal mind control being used in various media, i.e., motion pictures, music, commercial advertising, etc. I am sure after all these years, it has now been made a science.
Well, I've looked into that a little bit. There was something back, I think it was, there was an actual attempt to use subliminal advertising to sway a presidential election. And there's evidence to this. I think it was in the 2000 election, when the Republicans ran a television ad that said, at one point it flashed the word Democrat.
Or rat or something.
Yeah,
yeah. It was the word
the
rat.
part of this word was like clearly in there in a subliminal
I remember.
time, frame. So whether that the Republicans tried to say that was just an editing mistake, but it's hard to believe that they miss a frame and that of that sort. But subliminal advertising, I don't know a whole lot about. There is a whole field now that's going on called neuromarketing, where universities, in fact, are allocating some of their sophisticated brain imaging technologies to examine the way that advertising affects your brain, and not just for objective kind of academic studies to see how that works, but in fact to tune these things up. There's something called the Bright House Institute, which uses university computers. I think it's at Emory. We have it on our website at cognitiveliberty.org. But they use some of these brainwave machines, or actually magnetic imaging, to try and see how advertisements can bypass the areas of the brain that I guess are associated with deliberative processes, and it just gets straight to what they call the buy button in the brain. And there was talk about this actually in the last presidential election, about possibly being able to tune up political advertisements, or advertisements also to children. They use, there's some certain things where this could clearly go into an area where I think the majority of people would raise their hands and sort of say that they felt a little uneasy with what was going on there. There's a lot of scary stuff, and it's one of those areas where I don't like to talk about it too much without having plenty of time to put in little nuances, because you can sound like a complete kook if you talk about some of these things in just short little phrases.
Well,
but it's a good example. This type of use of the neuroimaging technology is a good example of, here you've got a technology that's basically morally neutral. I mean, things don't have moral qualities, but it has the potential to be put to use by people. They make a decision, and then they follow that decision up with behavior. It has the potential to be put to use that's actually quite malicious. But you shouldn't necessarily fault the technology, and I know you're not. It's how are these things going to be used?
Right.
You need some kind of an ethical compass here.
Well, the fact that you guys are that we're talking about it is good. Richard, you remind me of this. There's a woman whose name is Juliet Shore, and she's a professor at either Boston College or University of Boston or something. Anyway, but she's written a book that's called It's called Born to Buy, the commercialization of children. And it's amazing. And I have a 2.5-year-old son, so I'm sort of interested in this stuff. And I was blown away. This is a woman who came out of sort of an insider position from a large corporation as a marketing executive. And my God, what she reports is I tell you what. I mean, if you have children, it'll make you shake.
Well, like Dennis says, there's one technology that I think is incredible and exciting and nothing but cool in the abstract, and that's hypersonic sound. It's a way of transmitting.
Hypersonic sound?
It's a way of transmitting sound, which is kind of like an audio laser beam in a way, but really, really tight, so that you can stand, 3 feet outside of this beam and you hear nothing, but you walk into it, and it's high fidelity, very clear, in your head music or whatever it is that they want to send. And what companies are doing now is, I'm told that in Tokyo, there's Coke machines now that when you walk by them, they beam into your head, literally, the sound of ice dropping into a cup, and then the sound of the Pepsi, going popping open and glug glug glug. And
it's just in this zone. It's just in this zone or something in front of the machine.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's only in like about the 3 feet in front of this machine, but there's no warning sign. There's it comes right into your head. And it's been used also for as a type of crowd control, where they can project something, target somebody who's in the middle of a crowd, and tell them to step back or to do whatever they need to do. So all these technologies, like Dennis says, drugs, everything have sort of their good side, or their not the good side or the bad side, but the application, and I think the way to tune that or to guide it, at least one way that I'm spending time working on, is by building back into this thing what we talked about at the beginning, the idea of choice and the right to either say yes or to say no, and not have any of these things forced upon you, nor to have any of these things taken away from you on threat of being a criminal if you use them, without causing harm to other people.
Right. So it's both sides. In other words, don't be forced into using it, but also be allowed to do what you want with it.
Well, that's why we have the cognitive liberty would be, be able to do what you want with your brain without causing harm to others. And there's also the concept of cognitive security, which is being able to have that decision or the autonomy over what's going to be introduced into your brain or is going to be used to directly change how you think.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, those are the issues. It's really about choice. I mean, it's about cognitive freedom, the freedom not to have these things foisted on you, or if you choose to alter consciousness, for example, with a drug, the key thing is, as long as it doesn't hurt anyone else, you should be allowed to do that. But, I've often wondered, or I'm beginning to wonder, maybe Richard, myself, people like us, people in our generation, maybe we're just 19th century old fogies, and this notion of privacy and the notion that, the state shouldn't have complete access to every thought, maybe these are just outmoded ideas. And 100 years from now, people will look back and say, oh my God, those people were just dinosaurs. Of course, we're completely wired in a total telepathic communication at all times. And the notion of privacy is just some quaint 19th century idea that will be swept away.
I have no doubt that's going to be the case, and I think about that all the time. The reason I still argue for the notion of privacy with respect to the kind of stuff we're talking about is it works for what I see as the way I want to change policy, number one, and number two, our society, our legal system is built on what are clearly outmoded notions of the individual from the Enlightenment period, but those have been built into the Constitution. And so, if I'm a constitutionalist and a lawyer in court, that's what I'm going to be arguing. And so, until they change the Constitution and radically update it, these are some of the notions we kind of actually have on our side, if you want to sort of do it in that bifurcated way to make the points we want to make. But ultimately, I agree. I think privacy is a notion that's gone, but I don't think the idea of consent is going to go away in any near time, and that would mean that you have free will and a certain degree of agency to jack into these different networks, I think, in the future. And again, it may not be privacy that is what you will argue in the future, but I think you will still have a position that's legitimate to say, hey, you know what, I want to opt out for a little while, I want to opt in, and that just may be something to do with just, again, the agency or consent that will be recognized, hopefully, in the future.
Right. Look, you guys, it is about 13 minutes before 1 o'clock. So here's the question: if we're gonna bail out at the top of the hour, then I won't take a break here, and we'll talk for 10 more minutes. If you'd like to stick around even for a few more minutes, maybe till quarter after, we'll take a break here, and then we can come back and take a couple more questions from some people here.
Well,
It's up to you, though. Fully up to you.
Well, let's hang in.
I'm good. My only concern is I'm on a battery-powered phone that I'm surprised has actually held out as long as it has.
Huh.
So I'm good until that thing decides to turn itself off.
Okay, no problem. Then we'll take a break here, but we'll make it a short one, okay?
All right.
And this is Mike Hagan. You're listening to Radio Orbit. My guests are Dr. Dennis McKenna and Richard Glenn Boyer, and they've been generous enough with their time to spend going on 2 hours here with us. So we're going to get right back here to them. And we have another question from Bob, who's in the studio with us here, and I've got a couple more on the web as well. So, Bob, what do you have for the guys?
Well, this might be something a little more related to something that Dennis is involved in. The war on drugs, it's kind of like we're talking about two different categories. One I would refer to as sort of the body drugs, alcohol, meth, tobacco, caffeine, heroin, cocaine, that sort of thing.
Sugar, coffee.
Versus the psychedelics, yeah. We're sort of talking about psychedelics here and the freedom to be able to explore mentally using these psychoactive substances. But there's a whole problem. I mean, like we're in mid-Missouri. There's like a methamphetamine epidemic here. I mean, these guys are, in these little trailers cooking up this stuff with kids running around and that kind of thing. And clearly something has to be done to regulate it. I mean, I'm basically libertarian. I think if somebody wants to totally screw with their system, that's their business, and the government should keep their nose out of it. But you're going to find a lot of people that are saying, we've got to have a war on drugs because blah, blah, blah,
Well, yeah, I'm not advocating that drugs should just be completely unregulated.
Right.
I don't think that's practical, and that gets back to that issue about harm to others, like the kids that are around the meth labs and that sort of thing. I think you have to regulate them in some sense. I just don't think, but the whole concept of a war on drugs is misinformed. If you look at, like I sometimes tell my students, there's no such thing as a bad drug. But human behavior with respect to drugs can be very bad. And what we're really talking about is regulating human behavior. And I think...
And Dennis, you could substitute technology for the word drugs.
Exactly. Well, drugs are a kind of technology. It's all about human behavior. And I think with respect to something like methamphetamine, which is, it's a drug that's very hard to form a positive relationship with. There may be people that
That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, but that's really what it is. There may be people that are able to do that, but they're few and far between. So, what if we were to legalize meth and make it just pick the worst drug you can imagine, okay, meth. Right. What if we were to legalize it and make it a prescription drug? Then people that wanted to shoot meth, they would have to go to a doctor and get a prescription. Every time they got their prescription, they basically have to have a conversation with a healthcare provider who would have an opportunity to say, well, maybe you should rethink this. Do you really want to shoot crank? And they can talk about all the reasons maybe why that's not a good idea. And if the person says, yeah, doc, I really want to shoot crank, okay, here's your prescription. You know, but then they have to go back the next time and have that conversation again. So you create opportunities to basically intervene, in a sense, not by preventing them from doing it, but by informing them that maybe there are better choices they could be making. I think that would be, you know, a more humane way to approach it, and probably it would work better. I mean, what the situation that works now, it's just the, you know, you have the total punishment model, no opportunity to educate people that maybe this isn't a good idea. You know, I really believe in education over coercion. That's the way to get people to make good choices.
All right, I agree. All right, good. Richard, before your phone runs out, let's see, where was it? Ah, yes, a gentleman asks, tell us a little about the Human Enhancement and Human Rights Conference from May 26th at Stanford, and maybe you and Dennis can talk a little about that for a minute.
Oh, sure. That's a conference that the Center for Cognitive Liberty and Ethics is sponsoring along with Stanford's, not the law school, well, it's at the Stanford Law School, but it's being sponsored by another organization at Stanford, and also the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. And the idea of the conference is to actually begin some kind of high-level scholarly discussion and critique of the idea of human rights related to human enhancement drugs. So we've got people who are everything from medical, you know, PhDs and other people in the sciences to law professors to rhetoric professors, anybody who's got something to say and is willing to kind of, you know, have other people pull them apart for 3 days at this conference about it is going to be there discussing this, and I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to spawn a lot of scholarly work in this area, and that actually, as much as academics kind of get a bad rap for being in their little ivory towers, in the law that sometimes boils down to real change. And, you know, again, that's kind of like my little contribution in this area, is trying to think through the way that the law might just evolve in this area. So the conference is going to, I hope, be a step in that direction, and people who are interested in attending this, it's at Stanford on May 26th through the 28th, and like I said, there's a link on the front page of our website at cognitiveliberty.org.
Okay. Dennis, you got any comments on that?
Sounds like a fascinating conference. I wish I could be there.
I'm sure you have things going as well. Hey, let me ask you guys one other thing about with that conference. What is it? It's a 3-day conference?
Yeah, it's 2 full days and like a Friday evening.
And it's open to the public too?
Yep, anybody who wants to go. There's a fee to get in, but I believe for students it's either waived or it's significantly reduced.
Okay. Hey, I have a question, you guys, regarding sort of the technological side of this. We haven't talked about it a lot, but there's also the idea of enhancement, and the idea that some of these things, both pharmacological or technological, could be used to enhance us, to make us actually better, quote unquote, than we are. We really haven't talked about that much. Richard, what do you see happening there? I mean, we have all these things happening with nanobiotechnology and nanoneurology and nano this and that. Dennis, you should really start IBM, the itty-bitty machine company that you wanted to start. That's great.
Yeah, well, if any of your listeners have about $15 million, we'll get right on it.
All right. Well, you never know.
Right.
That area, I think, is one where it's popping right now. You know, and it's the idea of technologies have always tried to kind of overcome limitations that are imposed upon by our bodies. And now it's just developing in an area, particularly with pharmacology, where we see it from just students who are using Ritalin not because they have a diagnosis of ADD, but because they can stay up and study all night and they feel sharper and may be, in fact, sharper when they take their exams. And, that's clearly going to cause another very big social debate. And there are some very legitimate issues, you know. I mean, it's always been a question of, you know, what's fair in sort of getting ahead, and we have steroids that many people feel is an unfair kind of competitive aid. But then again, in schools, you know, when I got out of law school, everybody paid, you know, $10,000, the law firms paid for it, thank God, but it was thousands of dollars to take a prep class before you take the bar exam. And, you know, whether it's texts that are used to enhance you or drugs or other technologies, whether or not you're able to use them or whether someone else is going to be able to use them when you're unable to use them is going to be another big issue that this conference will look at. And there are people who are beginning to think through a lot of these issues, and most of them will be at this conference.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting when some of these new neurotechnologies emerge, and they are emerging. For example, VR technologies, virtual reality, and that sort of thing that can, for example, simulate drug states and do a pretty good job of it, get very close to what drug states are actually like. How is that going to be dealt with in the regulatory sense? Maybe it won't even be perceived by the power structure as something that needs to be regulated, or maybe it will. I mean, it doesn't carry the baggage with it that it would have if it were a drug. Somehow there's great concerns about the drug, but many of these neurotechnologies can simulate psychedelic and other states. So how will those be regulated? I don't know. Maybe Richard has thoughts on that.
Well, I think if they approach the magnitude or the experience of an actual psychedelic experience, they will be heavily regulated, just like psychedelics are. One area right now that human enhancement's been really fostered by, and which I think doesn't bode well, but then again, maybe it does, is that the United States government, for military purposes,
right.
You know, methamphetamine wasn't that the go pill that pilots have been using? And there's a program at DARPA right now called the AUG-COG program, which is augmented cognition. And all kinds of exoskeleton devices, but, you know, my focus is really on what's changing with thinking. And it could cut both ways, you know, and like Dennis has said, it's really a question of control. And if this is an area that threatens control, or which allows the people who push forward in this first to seize more control, then, you know, we're going to be back. We're going to be in the same matrix of power that we're in now with respect to psychedelics. One thing I wanted to say very quickly that kind of fits into this is that when we talk about the drug war, I can see that actually, once again, kind of a metaphor becoming real, and in terms of other drugs being used to fight the illegal drugs, so that the war, the power, the control mechanisms right now exist by and large outside of our bodies, whether it's police or tapping phones or whatever methods the government uses to suppress or control drug use. There's already encroachments going on that are going to bring a type of internal policing, which would be the potential. It would start with prisoners. It would start with other people who aren't very politically powerful, being forced to take drugs that essentially block the brain's ability to either have these things pass through the blood-brain barrier or otherwise reach the brain and affect them. And so I can see
such as the vaccines that are developed for cocaine and heroin users. Yeah.
Antabuse is one that, you know, this has existed since the 30s when it was, I guess, some people at a rubber plant went out and had beers at lunch and came back and all started vomiting intensely because of the chemical that was being used in this plant. And, you know, in American ingenuity, this was immediately turned into a drug that would be used to what they called to chemically enforce sobriety. And that's a good thing if you need this drug. It really is.
And if you take it by choice? no problem.
Right.
Precisely. But
Yeah.
what quickly happened was courts began imposing this on people who were, arrested for alcohol-related offenses. And we've got hundreds of thousands of people being arrested now for marijuana offenses, and it just so happens we have a drug under development that's got applications to reduce the effect of marijuana when smoked, and that could well be imposed as a probation condition.
Right. I've read reports up to like 75% or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that the drug war, could take the next strange and bizarre step, which is the good drugs versus the bad drugs inside your body.
Huh. Amazing. They go inside.
Drugs
the body.
will be used to fight drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And then in another sort of even more bizarre side to that coin, what we sometimes think of as the good drugs, the psychedelics and these sorts of things, have all been investigated thoroughly for warfare. And, there are scenarios involving aerosol release of LSD, MDMA, the whole gamut of these things in battlefield situations to essentially discombobulate the enemy.
Dennis, one of the guys here in the studio just wrote on a piece of paper and held it up and wrote MK Ultra.
MK Ultra.
And of course, so we know there's just this amazing history, odious history certainly, of all of this stuff.
Right.
Amazing. And still ongoing, imaginary. I imagine so.
I'll bet on it.
You know it, right. Okay, here's another one. Richard, again, this one's from the web. Ask Richard his opinion of Edward L. Bernays, or maybe just what the role of PR is in general in this whole game.
PR, public relations?
Public relations.
Well, I think it's kind of touched on that earlier in terms of just it's propaganda. And the question is, are people going to drink what they're selling, or are they going to look around?
Like ayahuasca.
And yeah. So I don't know. That's kind of been well worked over. The drug war, of course, has the government's side of it has benefited immensely from its use of PR or propaganda, and there's no I don't see that lessening. Although there's been some attempts to do so, and actually the budget's been going down for that. But ultimately, I think the government right now has kind of got its propaganda machinery really oriented on this so-called war on terror, which provides for it many of the things that the war on drugs has provided prior to this, which is an ill-defined enemy, one which allows them to take as much power as possible. And I think any of these will be facilitated or strengthened by the government's use of whatever form of media or propaganda, or if you want to call it PR, they can get their hands on, and the same with corporations to push their products. So it does come back to the idea that hopefully people will maintain a certain sense of responsibility to pay attention and to care about what goes into their minds, and to use their own filters appropriately. And if they want to accept propaganda or PR, I guess that's their choice. But hopefully others will kind of see through it and follow their own vision of things.
As I'm reading the news here, the synergies between these things are just amazing. Here's a story here. Listen to this, you guys. It says, what if you could one day unlock your door or access your bank account by simply thinking your password? Too far out, perhaps not. Researchers at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, are exploring the possibility of a biometric security device that will use a person's thoughts to authenticate her or his identity.
I'm aware of some studies that are being done now that allow people to. I'm not sure how far these are going, but what I've heard is the following scenario, which you could walk up to your ATM machine, which usually uses like a 4-digit code, think the numbers, and it would react appropriately. And the reason that this may work is apparently some of these magnetic imaging or other types of sophisticated brain imaging are showing that when people think of particular numbers, it's actually a very discrete, localizable area of the brain that apparently lights up, and that these can in fact be therefore correlated fairly successfully when one thinks about the numbers. So,
outrageous.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that's got some exciting. All of this stuff has exciting applications.
It's just amazing
but
to me. It's amazing. Yeah.
It is amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Now here's another one, Dennis.
Name a technology, and they'll find a way to use it to malicious ends.
Yeah. Well, now here
seems to be, we're very ingenious at that.
Yeah, and we're easily self-deluded too. That's for sure. I think who was it that said that man's ability for self-delusion was limitless or something like that. But anyway, Dennis, we talked about this off the air. The Lancet, which is a big UK medical journal, calls for LSD testing. I know this was sort of like, well, duh, but anyway, they're talking about, and in fact, the interesting thing about this article was the journal's editor, Richard Horton, said he was not advocating recreational drug use, but championed the benefits of researchers studying the effects of drugs such as LSD and ecstasy by using them on themselves in the lab. Now, this is like back to the 60s, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wow, it's amazing. So,
well, I read that editorial. I'm not sure I got that out of it, but, that's the old shamanic method.
Right. Heal yourself, right?
Right. And, in fact, psychedelics may, they undoubtedly probably do have medical applications, but there is this issue of why should they only be taken by sick people?
Right.
There's no doubt that they are some of the best tools around to understand consciousness and to understand the nature of the brain-mind relationship and all of these things that we're concerned about. So that sort of crosses over into this area of enhancement, in some way they really are, and cognitive liberty.
Mm-hmm.
They really are mind expanding, or they can be. That was what was touted for LSD when it first came on, and in some sense they are. So one of the issues with cognitive liberty is, should mind expansion or consciousness exploration be regulated or not, and to what degree, and so on.
Right.
All of these strategies are about control. The governments have interests in controlling people, and people have interests in resisting that control. So that you get this dynamic tension.
Mm.
And this is one reason that psychedelics are so dangerous.
They
really are dangerous in the eyes of the government because, as I think we said before, they make you have funny ideas. And funny ideas are inherently dangerous to the established order. We can't have people going around having funny ideas. It doesn't make for, good workers, good responsible citizens who just, work, pay their taxes, do what they're told, don't cause trouble.
Use the sanctioned drugs.
Right. It makes people into people who think too much are inherently dangerous.
All right. Okay, I got to do it. It's 1:15, so
you're going to cut us off.
No, I got to do this. This comes from the web. Mike, Dennis, La Charrera. Yep, I got to drag it out again. Not so much in a recounting of the events, but how Dennis looks back 35 years ago to that time period. How has it influenced his path? We all know where Terrence went with it, and how does it play into his current work, if at all? It would be interesting to get his take on the time wave theory if you guys have time, but how does that piece of work play, and does he look at resonant time periods at all? So I don't know, that's a lot. But anyway, how do you look back at La Charrera? How do you look at La Charrera 35 years ago?
Well, I look at it as something that happened 35 years ago. So it was very important. It set me on a path. That in some ways I'm sure I wouldn't be going the direction I went or am going if it weren't for La Charrera. But it's very hard to sort of, I'm not obsessed with it.
Right.
I've been there, I've done that, and I'm trying to take what I've learned from it and move on.
Okay.
One little echo of the past is somewhere, I think it was in The Invisible Landscape, or maybe it was in Dennis's brother's book, True Hallucinations. But I think in one of these books, somewhere I recall Dennis in the midst of one of these States saying "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," and
that would be me.
And here we are.
Here we are, you guys.
Here we are.
It's like Mark Twain's little saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme a lot.
Right.
Wow, I love it, and it's so true because there have been some certainly resonant things happen in my life in the last few months, I got to tell you. So, anyway, well, look, I think you guys, I think that's a good place to wrap things up. I can't tell you how much all of us appreciate it, and it's been an absolute pleasure. And Dennis, as I always tell you guys, your time is so valuable, and I recognize it, and I appreciate it, and so do all of the listeners, and in fact, listeners now tonight. Wherever they may be, not just locally and regionally. So, so from my heart, both you guys, Richard and Dennis, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, Mike.
Thanks very much for having me on. It's been a blast.
You bet, and we're going to put more and more of these things together as we move forward. And I'm getting close to having the opportunity to broadcast more frequently than just once a week. So, anyway, we've got big ideas, and you guys are real important in all of these things. So, thanks again, and we'll be in touch. All right.
Okay.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
We'll talk to you downstream.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Bye.
Wonderful. All right, everybody, that was Richard Glenn Boyer and Dr. Dennis McKenna. As I've said all night, you can find information about those wonderful gentlemen on the web at www.mikehagan.com.